Welcome to season 3 of Conversations with Life. We're gonna have this season this conversation about archetype, and this following conversation that you're going to hear is wide-ranging, doesn't really have much direction, but it introduces a lot of the ideas and themes and concepts that we'll be working with. And the reason why we're having this conversation is because it's kind of the conversation behind the conversation. It's the kind of conversation that each of our systems and lives are having with the reality that's underneath the reality. So, just to try to start to understand that and figure that out, I think is a really big piece of anybody's meaning path. It's going to be exciting to see where this takes us.
Welcome to Conversations with Life, Season 3. We're going to do a little bit of a focus this season on archetype. So we're going to start today's episode just by talking about what is archetype and what can we do about it.
What can we do about it? What can it do about us?
Do we have to do anything about it?
No, here's the funny thing about archetype is archetype to me represent the energies that are running underneath the surface of your reality, and they have. I've listened to a lot of Robert Moore, and although he's more of a conservative Jungian than I am, more of a Jungian than I am, period. I'm just kind of a fan.
What's a Jungian?
A Jungian. Somebody who is a follower and learner and follows the philosophies and ideas of Carl Jung. Carl G. Jung? Carl Jung. Anyway, so as I, listened to his stuff and really great stuff and very much focused on archetype, the idea that really caught me was that these archetypes act as if they have their own life. Mm. So there's, sometimes you're not dealing with archetypes. Archetypes are dealing with you, you're not trying to figure out your archetypes. Archetypes are playing you out. And I say all the time, play or be played. If you not really aware of the archetypes and how they take on these, how they have so much influence, then you don't really know the playbook. You're playing it out here, and you're not playing it at depth. So that's why archetypal psychology, or stuff that has to do with archetypes, is often called depth psychology, or that's part of the thing, is because this is what's happening underneath other things.
So, do you think there's a correlation between the more ancient ideas of demons and archetypes?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Kind of when demons and angels and other entities and whatever, we could talk about those. Those always, I'm going to crack my voice like I'm a 12-year-old. They're always somewhat archetypal. And in fact, you could say that everything is somewhat archetypal. When we take an archetype and take it really seriously, it becomes a deity. Sometimes, or at least a hero, or somewhere in between, a demigod or whatever. So the question you asked me though was, is there a connection?
Do you think it's possible that what people used to call demon or demonic possession was actually the person getting played by an archetype to an extreme level?
Well, Milo, who writes Chicken Kabbalah, and he's a Jewish practitioner of magic, etc. He said this really interesting thing in the Chicken Kabbalah, which is a great book, recommended to anybody. Really interesting look at the Kabbalah, which is, by the way, a whole set of archetypes that are really interesting and influential in our world. And he says something like this, the big question, the big debate is, are the things that we experience, like angels, demons, gods, are those in our heads? Are those psychological? Or are they real? And he says, well, yes. Because they're in your heads, but you have no idea how big your head is. Mm. Basically, you're it. You're experiencing it as you. Mm.
Yeah, and I think that goes along, that correlates with Carl Jung. He says something very similar, where it's like, who's to say that what's going on in your mind is any less real than what's going on in your outer world?
Yeah, in fact, he says this really interesting thing about Jesus, Carl Jung. He says, people ask me if, because I believe Jesus is an archetype of self. That's what he writes a chapter in a book that he ate on that talks about Jesus as the archetype of self, right? And he's like, do I think Jesus isn't real? And he's like, and people think because I think he's an archetype, I don't think he's real. And he's like, I think that makes him much more likely to have been an actual person. Because he's looking at his patients, and he's looking at thousands of patients, and he's seeing what he calls the archetype of Christ, which he calls the archetype of self. You know, fantastic stuff if you ever want to go wade through Carl Jung. But he says that's more likely to have it be like, if he sees it on the archetypal plane, he knows it's showing up in the real world. People who are holding that archetype are showing up. Like the archetypes in some ways are more real than reality. And then reality builds itself. In fact, you could say it's the structure on which reality builds itself for human beings.
So let's take a step back real quick, because it's a brand new season. Hopefully no one has started listening here. Go back and binge, people, for goodness sake. It's 2024. But everyone knows we ingest all content through binging now, so do that. But let's go back a little bit.
Yeah.
Define archetypes. What do you mean when you say archetypes and archetype, and then maybe use the archetype of self as the example that you then unpack this with a little bit? Go real layman for me.
I want to hear what Soch says. What is an archetype? I want to hear your answer.
Soch is going to be like, I'm crazy.
I would say an archetype is a flavor of energy that has distinct characteristics, and it's something that any human being can experience, although they would experience it uniquely. So mother would be an archetype that, you know, at least all people that have a uterus could potentially experience. But I think, you know, even outside of that body form, you could experience the energy of mother and express the energy of mother.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be kind of my basic archetype.
Okay. So, a form of energy. You want to add anything to that, Steve?
Yeah, I think definitely archetypes have an energy structure, an energy component, but I would say an archetype is a structure on which your perception reality is based. It's kind of like the
lens through which you see the world.
Yeah, it's the hard software. You see what I'm saying? Like the hardware is just reality, just is. It's a thing we are, right? But there are structures that seem to be universal in everybody's experience. And those structures are really, really important to understand. They're kind of we can think of them as geography. They're the geography of the soul, right? So there's just existence happening. We're there, and in that geography, in that there-ness, there's patterns of expression that are universal. And archetypes are really funny because they're very, very universal. That's the nature of archetype. They're in the collective. Carl Jung came up with this idea of the collective unconscious, that there's a shared experience that we're all having that's not just us living in the world together. That there's a field or a process that we're all sharing the same brain on some level that we can't access entirely, but that we can access. And in that realm, there are these structures that seem to be the basis of our of everything that we do, you know. So everything kind of comes back to an archetype. So the basic archetype, the one that's probably the best example, the archetype itself is a good one, but I think one that people can access really well is anima and animus, and that is the archetypal feminine and the archetypal masculine. You know? Okay. So we have presence and we have openness and connection, and those two things pulling on each other and showing up in that geography. So in the collective, according to Carl, and other Jungians and people who have thought about this, and it shows up in a lot of different religious contexts, etc. In the collective, there are these energies that represent presence and openness. I don't even like to talk about when you talk about masculine, feminine. People bring in gender and they bring in these are energies, right? These are kind of structures. They have nothing to do really with our body
reproductive organs
until they do, right? But so it's really important to understand these structures. Now, what happens is when you're a dude, when you're born with a penis and testosterone more than estrogen, right? Is gonna dominate your early experience. You'll connect with that archetype because that's what happens. You resonate with it. And so you'll bring in all the energy of maleness or masculinity or animus into you won't connect with your anima, but your anima is still there. So you're part of everything, and your anima is there. So your anima is going to get you. Eventually, you're going to fall in love with it, or it's going to mess up with you, or it's going to make you, weird in some way. If you ignore that feminine side, which we generally do in this world, right? We really work on dichotomies. Then it's going to get you. So those are the two that I would say I've not known a human that doesn't have to work with masculinity and femininity. It's so part of the structure of life that you have to work with it. Now, when you see that as an archetype, you think, oh, those things are just there, and those things are the word is numinous. They have energy. Mm-hmm. So archetypes have energy. They bring energy. The reason why they're important is because they affect us. They shine. They shine their light. They shine their influence on us, and they're in there. So you better be aware of them, because eventually you're going to have to answer that energy that's coming, that's shining through them and coming through and being you. Yeah.
It's interesting to think of them as structure, because that kind of brings me back to my original sort of engagement with archetype. Wherever I learned that word, probably some junior high or high school English class.
Yep.
The imagery that solidified that meaning for me was like a statue or an idol. It's something that you are referencing reality with. And part of my faith expansion journey was, in my mind, what I was doing was burning down the archetypes. I think what I was actually doing was burning down the identity that I felt like I had to have, that was measuring myself and my worth against archetypes. But it was interesting that I had kind of that image of burning down these idols almost. And as you're talking about that, and we're okay, is it structure? Is it energy? Okay, it's both. I think that kind of helps me understand that process in myself a little better, that I was using the archetypes not just to reference reality, but to actually reference my value, my worth. Mm-hmm. And one of the dangers about doing that with archetype is you're never going to measure up to an archetype. Mm-hmm. It's always going to be bigger and better and more ideal and perfect than you, or worse on the shadow side.
Well, I mean, if it's like a precursor, right, and it's just, if it has energy by itself, and then you apply your energy to it, you can't add you can't be bigger than a thing that you're adding energy to. So presumably, does that make any sense?
Yeah.
You know, like if it's got energy X and you're adding energy Y, your X plus Y, that's already bigger than you were by yourself and always will be. So it's,
yeah.
You know, I don't know. Maybe I just went too math with it. But.
No, it's good. I like that. And you know, we could turn it around and say, isn't it awesome that there's these structures that you can study and connect with that are bigger than you? Mm-hmm. Because when you're not getting played by them, when you understand that you're always maybe a distortion or maybe a unique expression of a set of archetypes.
Yeah.
Then you can go back and find that archetype and clean up the energy that you fucked up. You know, and I think a lot of pain is that we somehow get it twisted or wrong or whatever. I want to back up just a second and say, why would you care about this? This sounds esoteric. This sounds, you know, I had a friend who is like, I was talking to him about some stuff about the unconscious and stuff and Carl Jung. And he's like, yeah, I talked to my therapist about Carl Jung. And he's like, yeah, he was on cocaine. He was a heroin user. I don't know. I really don't know. I actually don't think that's true. I think that's some other people, but not Carl. Carl freaking Jung is crazy Carl, who says that this psychic reality, these things that are in this unconscious that I can't put my finger on, I can't measure and weigh and figure out, are real. And in fact, more real in some ways than actual reality, than the reality that we exist in the world. That's kind of a crazy assumption. You know, if you're a materialist and you say reality is only what we see here and that's it, that's all. There are no gods, no demons, no angels, no any of those things, and I just don't want to think about those things. Well, good luck. I mean, my experience is when you do that, you're just making yourself ignorant of the geography that's in the mind world, that's in the unconscious, that's in the energy, that's there in the structure of our being psychologically. You know, like, and when you understand them and start to think about them and learn about them, and communicate, and even in some circles, like in Tantra and stuff, we talk archetypally, you know, like I'm going to try to speak an archetype. It's really interesting to try to do that. And you'll find some personal truths that way. You'll find some interesting stuff. So, you know, basically I'm saying that it's possible, you don't have to believe this, but it's possible that there is this reality that's as real as the mountains out there. And if I don't take them for granted, and if I want to get from point A to B, and there's a mountain there, it's going to make a difference, you know?
Yeah.
And if I feel that, if I'm that way in life, and the one that most people, the mountain that's between where people are and where they want to be, for most people is the anima or animus. It's their opposite. It's their opposite archetype for that they experience as their gender. So,
Keith, you've done some work with this theme as an educator, yes?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we talk about archetypes in the hero's journey, which we talked about before the show, and I've done archetypes as well in philosophy, looking at the different, you know, the sage and the pupil or the master and all those kinds of things in Eastern philosophy, and I'd consider them to be kind of archetypes too. That whole, like, you're either the learner or the master. A lot of, like, you know, Confucianism, Taoism, that kind of stuff is split into that one or the other, and sometimes it's both. And so it's an interesting set of principles, I guess, to me, like looking at the world or even people that you interact with in the form of archetypes is really informative. So for me, I look at an archetype and I go, okay, how do I deal with it? Or how does it deal with me? Or how do I play it? And how does it play me? And I can look at someone and say, okay, if that person's archetype is the hero or the rescuer or the mother energy or the sage or the, you know, student, it informs how I think of them and how their experience affects mine, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It allows me to sort of direct that.
Yeah, that's a cool idea. It almost gives you an understanding, a common point between somebody else's experience and yours, if you can look at it archetypally. And
Yeah.
I feel like that's one of the things that like personality tests and stuff like that, where they can be helpful, is that, you'll, instead of somebody being one of 8 billion, they're now like one of 16.
Right.
And so you're able to like connect from that place of archetype. So I love that that piece. How would you define archetype?
So to me, an archetype is kind of like a skeleton or a base set of values, right? So it's like if you can reduce someone down to their archetype, right? Maybe it's their temporary archetype, maybe it's their archetype that they've been dealing with for a long time, but you can not like reduce them. Sounds a bit intense, but you can look at somebody and identify an archetype. Then that means the archetype is a part of their whole, right? And so you can, to me, an archetype is like I think the lens is probably the easiest way that I can picture it, right? It is a set of principles and values that color your perception of reality. So yeah, I definitely am more in the way of what Steve was saying of the lens through which you see the world, the software that integrates the hardware with the memory.
Do
Do
you feel like you could think of an example where you've been played by an archetype?
Oh yeah. Okay. Educators, we fall into archetypes all the time, and a lot of the time we're put into archetypes. But I don't know if this is like one of the formally recognized archetypes, right? But the rescuer or the hero archetype, right? I had to be everyone's hero. I had to save everyone. That kind of archetype. That archetype played me for a long time, and like especially if you're someone who takes their worth from the value you add to other people. You typically get stuck in either the archetype of savior or people pleaser, right? And you like just want to do something for everybody. So, that this like part of the spirit journey that I've been going through and the awakening that I've been going through has been identifying and shedding my, I guess, adherence to the archetype that had me trapped, that was playing me, a year ago. And so, I mean, Steve can probably attest to this. Like, I solved everyone's problems all the time. That was my job, and I did it well. Like, and that was how I had value.
I looked at Keith and I said, man, dude, slow down. You don't gotta do all of that, Yeah. Beautiful that you do, but like, you gotta chill out in that process. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, that's like the reality is that I kind of didn't have a choice, right? Like eventually it wasn't sustainable anymore, and the archetype didn't serve me, and the playing of me became old, right? And I shed it. But I mean, some of the places that you, like one of the things that's beautiful about the world and about experience is that when you experience other people and other archetypes, it often gives you the tool or the freedom or the information that you need to change, to grow, to shift, right? So being like, let's say in Steve's poetry club, right? I would just go and people would be like, what are you doing? Why are you going to this club? You're not running this club. I'd be like, no, I just want to go. I just want to write my poetry and read it out loud. I didn't have to be the hero in poetry club. I could just let it go. And I think I got put into a different archetype in poetry club because I wrote only sad dad poetry for a long time. And then I remember writing a more emotional poem that wasn't sad dad, and it was, other stuff. And they were like, what the hell is this? This is not your poetry, So, archetypes play you all the time, but that was my big one, was the rescuer, the savior.
Do you have a good story, Steve, of getting played by an archetype?
Oh, all of them all the time. And
a little bit of everything all of the time.
It's what's fascinating is I do have stories, and I'm going to give an example of this. What Keith said is that those are archetypes, for instance, savior, or what's the other one you said?
The savior, the rescuer, and the people pleaser.
Right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are energies on which are kind of like, there's the archetype, which is kind of like the hero, which has its own history and whole thing that we can talk about. And there's counterfeits to those archetypes. So the archetype has a lot of energy. We feel good when we contact that energy, but we contact it in some way that doesn't actually balance our lives or work. It's like for a minute, it's like you catch, it's like when you're on a trampoline, right? And somebody bounces you, you catch their energy, and you're not quite ready for it.
And you end up on your ass. Someone's jumping next to you,
right? And you're off the trampoline. If you were ready for that and you wanted that to happen, you can ride that energy, and it feels really good. And that's the potential of using an archetype versus being played by it.
Yeah, I like that.
Which I think is kind of interesting. No, I have a savior complex for sure. I really like, there's part of me that really gets a lot of energy when somebody is just so broken and they have nowhere else to go or whatever. And I'll stay with them. I'll stick with it. I will deal with incredibly difficult humans so that, like Soch here.
I was gonna say me.
No. So it's just actually my first relationship is not like this. But I will deal with incredibly difficult people, and I like big energy people. I like people who are expressive, and all that is good. But sometimes it's really hurt me. I had one client that came here. I didn't tell them to come here, and they were going to stay here for a few weeks and get a lot of help. Whatever, they were from a different country, and so many problems with that situation, right? And I should have said, don't come, But part of me is like, I can do it.
Yeah.
I can, that situation is way above my pay grade, not in my process, somebody who's really, really, breaking psychologically. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not somebody who can deal with somebody who's breaking.
Right.
Who's having an actual psychotic break.
Yeah,
not good. And I've had a couple times where I've tried to do that. It doesn't work. Somebody who's having an actual psychotic break is not somebody I can help.
Yeah,
But boy, I'm sure gonna try.
Yeah, and I feel like
that's an archetype playing me. I'm getting bounced off the trampoline in those circumstances rather than being in the energy of the thing and riding that successfully.
Yeah, and I feel like there's these archetypes kind of like snowball, right? So like the hero might be the base archetype that can lead to the genuine hero, just the person who is there to help and doesn't give more of themselves than they can and saves people. And then it can snowball into the savior, right? Which still can be positive, and then it can snowball into the sacrificer, right? Like the person who just gives and gives and gives until they die. And then that leads to the martyr, right? Exactly. And the martyr is really the I wouldn't say the negative, but it's the ultimate of that archetype playing you. Like the hero's archetype just burning through somebody, right? And teachers, like I said, but also like medical professionals and people who are very empathetic tend to get like destroyed by the martyr archetype, right? And you see it in like victims of abuse where they just stay and get destroyed because they feel like it's their job to die for this thing, right? It's just woof.
It is. Well, you see, even the martyr could be a healthy archetype,
right? That's what I mean. Like it can be the other way, and then, but it has such a volatile. Like, like martyr is essentially like self-sacrifice, and you can do that for a noble cause, and it can be beautiful and great. Like Christ is the ultimate example of a martyr, if you want to go religiously, right? But it can also be this inauthentic destruction. So it's kind of a weird, like, sometimes I'd remember sitting there going like, oh yeah, I'm the rescuer, I'm the hero, and I'd feel pride in that, and then be like, am I, if I'm feeling pride in it, also the
like
true
the
version of
ego
that
trip.
archetype? Like,
Yeah.
I don't. That means I'm being played a little
It's
bit.
funny because
Yeah.
like what the martyr is telling themselves, you know, in this more like shadow version, is that they are giving everything, and that they're so humble, right?
Mhm.
But in reality, it's like the biggest ego trip ever to like
Right.
see how close you can get to like basically death in self-sacrifice.
Yeah, and how much people will love you for it. You know, like it is a trip. I mean, I used to get a lot of really like a lot of my energy came from people being like, I can't believe you did that for me. That's so great. I'm so grateful. And I'd be like, yeah. And then when I didn't get that gratitude, I'd be furious or upset or feeling indignant or somehow entitled to that, you know. And it's like, okay,
Something's up.
something's not happening here. This is definitely the shadow version. I like that.
Yeah, when I'm thinking of like the archetype and the energy and the structure, I keep getting this image of like somebody hooking a fire hose up to your system. So when you encounter archetypal energy, it's like they're hooking a fire hose up, and it's gonna run through the complexes that you built over your life. And that's where it both has the opportunity to have individual expression, but it also has the opportunity to like up level all of your toxic patterns.
Well, yeah, it's absolutely. Well, to riff, Robert Moore, he talks about how we didn't come here to be an archetype. You know, we came here to be us. And if we start being too much an archetype, well, you know, we'll lose our humanity.
Yeah.
And become narcissistic, become abusive in some way. Self-abusive, other abusive, doesn't matter, right? Like, we didn't come here to be an archetype. And if we don't access and work with archetype, we don't have energy. So literally, you could make the case, and I think Robert Moore makes this case, that all energy, especially like psychic energy, motivation, directional energy, comes through archetype. And religion was originally meant to help people access their energy and not let it get over them, but so like, you had to keep these rules or keep these disciplines, and you had a guy over you who was like, hey, I'm your priest or master or whatever, I'm the, your Jedi trainer, whatever. Right. And you need to,
they help you not get too big for your britches.
Exactly. Yeah. And at the same time, then there's a steady access of that archetypal energy through ritual, through other types of experiences, where they kind of show you how to work with it. So that's kind of the game here, is like not getting carried away, not getting what he calls possessed by the archetype, and not having any access to that archetype. It's funny because people who don't say they're religious and say there's nothing, it's material, will end up playing the archetypes harder than anybody else. They'll just say, well, I'm just just being myself. So it's really fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that it's important to at least get curious about when you're in that kind of post-religious pendulum swing. It's really common for people to go all the way to like materialist, empirical data science, and I think that that's an important swing, because there's a part of us that feels really betrayed by the amount of power that we gave up in the the religious game. But I think it's also important to like remember that there's still a possibility that there are energies out there that you can't measure with a ruler and you can't see with a microscope, and that they are having an impact on you, whether you want to believe that they're there or not. There's stuff going on, and to get curious about that, because otherwise, like you're saying, like you're going to be played by the archetype of skeptic. or whatever, you know.
Whatever that is.
Even in not succumbing to an archetype, you can succumb to an archetype.
Yeah, there's a interesting closed-mindedness around being open-minded as an archetype. Identifying that, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So we have systems of archetypes, and there are a lot of different systems that are looking at the geography of the subconscious energy, whatever. And they're interesting to look at. You know, it's interesting to see. And you like, which one is right? And the answer is all of them. I mean, if it exists in a major world religion, probably it's accessing a major archetype that really has a lot of energy. So the Hindu gods, each one of those is a different archetype. The Egyptian, you know, any of the pantheons, the Greek gods, there's all these archetypes. They probably, it's good to know that, you know.
Well, and it's interesting to study, you know, cross-section world religion. There's
So
you can
many
almost
types.
line up a chart of, okay, this, you know, is Zeus, and this is the same archetype, but with a different name and a different religion, you know. And there's something to that. I feel like that was like a real initial kind of crack in my shelf as I was homeschooling my kids, and we did this whole series on world religions, and I was just like, should I be learning this? Something's happening
Well, and
here
it's so
that I don't think the church wants me to experience.
Yeah. It's so interesting. In monotheistic religions, they still do archetypes. They just call them saints, you know, or bodhisattvas, or, you know, these sub characters in the religions that take on the archetypal roles. I mean, Mary, the feminine, was going to show up in Christianity. You know, it's always been there. Sophia Christ, you know, is an ancient archetype for the feminine aspect of Christ. But Mary kind of took that role, you know, as the Sophia energy in the Christ story, the divine feminine, you know, and became, in many types of Christianity, more worshipped or as worshipped as Jesus. You know, see, they come through. Those archetypes are
do, but it's
pesky.
funny because when I think about Mormonism, it's almost like a huge part of that dogma was to actually keep us from encountering archetype with any level of consciousness. Like hardcore, we were not even supposed to really spend time thinking about divine feminine, heavenly mother, let alone like worshiping Mary was like the worst possible thing. Like, or worshiping any kind of saint. Like that was like a big, huge taboo, no thing, at least in the way that my system interpreted that. Is there, like, what would you say about Mormonism and archetype? Like, where does it show up?
You know, it's sure interesting. And I could say somewhat in a kind of semi-deification of general authorities. Like this guy he's a really good teacher. This guy is he's really loving. This guy is, you know, like there's kind of this character that they take on. So I would say it shows up there. Mormons love their fantasy books. There are, you know, Orson Scott Card, Brandon Sanderson. There are several major fantasy books, and Comic-Con is a big freaking deal in Utah.
Imagine
Yeah,
that Mormons would like fantasy.
That's almost like a reaction to the fact that there's no archetype in the religion.
That's what I'm saying. I'm saying they sneak in. You know, in the actual religion.
I mean, the martyr is the quintessential archetype in Mormonism, right? I mean, you've got Christ, who everyone's like, do you even believe it? Yes, they believe in Christ, right? When you have Joseph Smith, who's supposed to be the modern day Christ, because he literally, you know, resurrects the church, brings back Christ's power, and then dies a martyr.
Yeah.
Like the martyrdom of Joseph Smith is like a whole church video you can get on your doorstep if they decide that you should see it, right? So like I feel like what the martyr, the teacher, and they're all archetypes that I think stem from the initial Christ archetype, right? Which I will give credit to, like they picked a good base, right? But if you're in the church, you are a teacher, you are a servant, and the ultimate servant is the martyr, right? And like that's the deal. So like Sunday school is huge, and if you're a teacher or you get a teacher's calling, then you must be amazing. If you're a teacher for the elders quorum, I wasn't, but you know that's like the whole thing. So I would say that everything else is done to make you not pay attention to any other archetype that doesn't fit what they want. You do not pay attention to Heavenly Mother. You do not even deserve to think of her. You're so lowly as a human sinner that you should not have your eyes or heart on Heavenly Mother, because that will tarnish her. Like that's the sidewalk cupcake of the Heavenly Mother story, right? It's like, oh, it's delicious, but we don't know where it's been. Okay, sidewalk cupcake. Right, you don't know where it came from. Don't pick that up. But anyway, that's what I would say. There is a lot of othering. There's a lot of fear, and it's any religion, but I mean, especially modern ones. Control is a huge deal. Power is a huge deal. And I'm not saying this to be like the church sucks. The church is human, and all humans kind of suck, especially when you put them together, right? Sometimes, but there is a very tight grip on the archetypes that are worshipped by the church, to the point where even, you know, they go beyond, to the point where you're not even allowed to talk or symbolize the actual death of Christ, because it's all about the fact that he was resurrected. The ultimate reward for the martyr is what's focused on, right? And the what would you call it? The greatest benefit, you know, like the atonement of all mankind. It's like, this is the ultimate success of the martyr, right? And then Joseph Smith did it again, because he brought the power back to humanity. Without it, we were all doomed, right? So that's sort of what, to me, seems to be what's celebrated. Like if I was writing the Book of Mormonism, the archetype is the martyr. Yeah,
right? Yeah, I definitely feel that. The other thing that might just tie right into this, but that I'm feeling is the archetype of the perfect Mormon church member. You know? And I think probably martyr is like a big one there, but there's like
the servant.
Definitely this like Molly Mormon Peter priesthood thing is real.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, is that servant, missionary, all of those things are tools in the machine of faith or the church or whatever you want to say, right? So like the ultimate archetype is to be a powerful and effective tool.
It's interesting. It's almost like subverting the archetypes into a new creation. So don't do those archetypes, do ours. In a way,
true archetypes.
The one true archetype. Like you do our bit, do our archetypes, and I think that's fascinating. Because let's take something like sexuality, which we talked about, but like, you know, there's sexual archetypes. You know, sexuality shows up in archetype. It shows up in the prostitute archetype. It shows up in the I'm trying to think. Yeah, the seductress, and then on the other side, the femme fatale. It shows up in the Don Juan, you know, the lover, the unattuned lover archetype, and it's like don't do those. Take the energy from those and put it into our archetype, which is Peter Priesthood, you know, Molly Mormon. Like somehow it's like, here's these parts of you that are running around, like, yeah, put those into this new archetype, you know, which is interesting.
Yeah, and I think that highlights another part of the player be played thing, is it's not necessarily always that you're getting played by the archetype, it's that other people who understand archetype can actually use it almost as a technology to control you. And I think that's probably the biggest reason to understand archetype, is so that you can feel when other people are using it to get your resources and to get you to do what they want.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to what I was saying before, right? If you can understand the bones of a story, right? Like we talk about the the plot how am I blanking on an English term?
The plot map, the chart.
Yeah, like the plot map, right? Like the exposition and rising action and the conflict and the climax and the falling action and the resolution, right? If you can understand the elements that make up a story, then you're not surprised or taken advantage of by the story. If you can understand the elements that make up a personality or an archetype, then you are better able to use that personality archetype, whether you want to pretend to embody it, actually embody it, avoid someone else who's embodying an archetype from affecting you. The more you know, the more power you have, right?
Absolutely.
And so like that's what I was talking about before with if you can understand or if you can identify someone's archetype, that informs how much they can affect you. And to me, that's the most powerful thing about the understanding. Because yes, it also informs how much I can affect them and it informs how much I can affect the world around me. But really what it does is it preserves my perception of myself. If I know my archetype and I know your archetype, then every time we have an interaction, I can be like, well, of course Soch said that because, you know, Soch's archetype is this and therefore, you know. So really what it comes down to is like you never can avoid being played by an archetype or by your own archetype or whatever. Like it's impossible to completely avoid getting played, but you can minimize the damage that can happen and you can maximize the benefit if you really understand, which I think is kind of what this whole thing is about in the first place.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I don't know. I think we do center our personalities around an archetype, right? But then I think we also do all of them, right? So it's kind of a funny thing where we'll center, and I think it's almost like a constellation of archetypes. But it seems to me that there is kind of a central one or, you know, type of energy that each human being carries. And it's curious to kind of like think about it that way.
Yeah, we've talked about like this, are you a soul person or a spirit person? That's to me kind of like an archetype too.
Yeah,
like.
I think that is like a group of archetypes. I think soul represents a group of types of archetypes that person is working with, connecting to, right? And spirit is a group of archetypes that person's, you know, whether it be like the holy man, the sage, or the seductress, you know, you know, those are on those two different ends, and you know, there would be like a whole host of archetype in those two. I was going to mention before we leave the religion thing, there's a great character in the Book of Mormon musical.
I really want to see it.
Oh, you got to see it. And it's a most crude, offensive, terrible, wonderful thing I've ever seen, right? That's the Book of Mormon musical. I had no idea how to feel for weeks after I watched it, but it was so good. But one of the elders gets Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and the Book of Mormon all mixed up together.
Oh, goodness.
And like almost like writes his own gospel based on all these things mixed up, and it's the most beautiful thing. It's like,
and then Luke said, it shall come to pass.
Because archetypally, and no, totally, he gets it all mixed up. Because archetypally, it totally works.
Yeah, I mean.
And the fantasy of Joseph Smith, the archetype he was connecting to, you know, this hero, special one.
Yeah, the chosen one.
The chosen one kind of archetype that he was working with.
Is Luke, is Frodo, is Harry Potter, they're everywhere.
And this kid is so into fantasy that he can't get the church separated from these archetypes. And it's
which should be a red flag.
It's absolutely it's not a red flag, it's actually beautiful. He ends up being almost like truer to himself than the others, you know, who are kind of trying to stuff the archetype into an actual story that is like.
I mean, it's like you were saying about Carl Jung, right? Like if you believe the archetype exists, it's more likely to show up in the world. Like if the chosen one is such a huge archetype, it's likely that there are people who, you know, embody the chosen one because that's a skeleton set of principles and beliefs that shows up regularly enough for us to have noticed it, hyperbolized it, and made it into fantasy stories.
Yeah.
Right? But like the chosen one, you know, if you want to like Neo or whatever, right? We go to extremes in fiction, but we also go to extremes in faith because you need to. Right? Like it's like when people tell you to be perfect, like, you know, you got to do this crazy high standard so that hopefully when you're shooting for that, you'll at least be pretty good.
Yeah.
Right. Like if we had shown, like, let's, you know, the argument for the pro LDS and I don't care about the histories person is like, of course we made him seem perfect and he's not, because he's human, and so we had to make him seem perfect so everyone had a perfect goal to shoot for and blah blah blah. Right. So to me, it makes total sense that the archetypes match with religion so well, because religions are stories that we tell too, right? Yeah. Regardless of how much truth is based on. But for me, I love the getting lost in fantasy thing with religion, because it is just so it lines up so beautifully. Like, it's like when someone compares Harry Potter and Star Wars, and like, it's a chosen one who has a magic stick that can, like, you know, his brother dies and he has a companion and blah blah blah.
I related to that character so much because that was my youth. You know, I escaped into story. I escaped from what otherwise was pretty painful adolescence. And I read every fantasy book that was available. And that was before fantasy was like a whole section of the library for youth, you know?
Right.
Like, I had a
you had like selection. Robert Jordan and a couple others.
Robert Jordan wasn't really even there yet.
Wow.
I read Piers Anthony and Terry Brooks and, you know, Lord of the Rings over and over again.
Yeah.
You know, so it was a more limited selection. So I wanted to move on to some of the other just systems, just to mention the systems of archetypes, right? Mm-hmm. And these are all worth looking at. Robert Jordan talks about the 4 main archetypes, and Carl Jung talked about the 4 aspects of the soul. And he made a diamond-shaped soul, and partly feminine, partly masculine, kind of set on each other like a Markova, right? And that's kind of like an interesting view. But he identified these archetypes as king, warrior, magician, and lover, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And those are really valuable. And I would say that behind each of those is a kind of a host of archetypal energy, right? There's lots of different expression of magician, lots of different expression of king. And then on the feminine side, you have queen, warrior, Amazon, creatrix from magician, and lover, of course.
Right, that one stays.
The feminine flavor, and you have these, and those are really interesting. If you want to read the book or go listen to the YouTube stuff on those, it's really fascinating. Mm-hmm. Those have been endlessly valuable to kind of see the different, you know, archetypes coming through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It looks like we are coming close to the end of the episode, so I feel like, what's Sosha's answer to the question she posed to Steve and I? Have you fallen into any archetypal traps?
Yes. And I actually wanted to kind of bring this into practical application. So I think it'll work to like kind of answer the question, but I'm gonna pose a couple situations to Steve so that, and just see how would you like sort of diagnose archetypally what's going on in these situations that I had in my life. Where I feel like I was getting played by an archetype. I didn't know, because I didn't know about this stuff. I just felt like I was being ridiculous, somewhat childish, and I couldn't help it. Like, I could not help what was happening. I was completely confused and overwhelmed. And part of that confusion and overwhelm was I was not particularly being honored by another person, but it was a person that I loved deeply, and my system didn't know what to do because the only option that seemed available was to demonize them and say they're a bad person because they're treating me bad. And I couldn't do it because I could tell there was something else going on. So one example is I fell head over heels in love with one of my best friends. And she was not interested in that kind of relationship. But we had a fantastic friendship. Like we would just go into energy together and we would just jive and we would laugh and we would, you know, hold space for each other. It was just this magical kind of friendship that I'd never experienced anything like it. So I totally fell head over heels in love with her. And every time we would spend time together, I was like, my anxiety was over the top because I knew it was going to end. And the whole way home, I would sob, even if we had the best time. But then it was even worse if like she said something that hurt me or whatever, right? And I just felt stupid but I was completely obsessed. I could not stop thinking about her. So what would you say, Steve, if I came to you with that, from an archetypal lens?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I would say your animus is active, for one. You know, so one of the things that happens is we don't pay attention to this gendered other animus. I don't know what it is, but we experience ourselves on a like some kind of pull on the gender scale or whatever. Yeah. And then we meet somebody who's on the opposite, right? So this person is often, we call it like twin flame or something. So like they feel like they're made almost of the same stuff we are.
Yeah.
And it makes them impossible to ignore and also impossible to be with. You know, it's like having a relationship with yourself, but just like this other aspect of yourself that you've been avoiding for all these years, right?
Yeah.
And so that's definitely animus possession, like especially where you feel very insecure. So the masculine or the animus wound is insecurity. Where you're expected to show up in presence. You're like, how do I do that? I haven't been trained for this. I don't know how to be a man. I don't know how to show up. And how the hell do I find presence when there's all this going on, right? Like, but so you feel very insecure, and you're trying to show up. Can't quite get there, right? So, and definitely there's this lover piece, or the star-crossed lovers, where love is really great as this idea. And it's really impossible as a landing reality in this really like super romantic way, right? So there's this kind of archetype of this longing lover that never gets there, And
the unrequited love.
Unrequited lover.
It's just,
it shows up in kind of the romantic love or the classical, like, Dante looking at Beatrice on the bridge and she's his love. And he never sees her again. But he's in love his whole life. And she is the shining star that he does everything he does to create, to work with. So that kind of shows up. That's kind of healthy in a way, but for most people that shows up and it's like, or I guess courtly love or that kind of thing, right? It shows up as, oh shit, I'll never ever do it, and so it keeps us from actual relationship, and keeps us from.
But also, I feel like it was a pathway to actual relationship for me. It was almost like I had to let that play out. I had to stop repressing that energy. And there was a part of me that knew it. I can go back in my journal and it was just like, I am in love with this person and I have to see this through. Yeah. Even though I know it's going to destroy me.
Yeah, and it's kind of being in love with love, And that the person's never going to measure. That's the problem with ideal love, You're in love with love and that person's never going to do it.
Yeah.
And so you almost have to have a person to take that place so that you can realize that, So in your body and your soul, we can teach that, right? But you don't know it until you really, really get your heart broke.
Yeah.
So that's a really good example of how archetype plays out,
Yeah, as I've looked back and we've studied the different masculine and feminine polarities, that definitely feels like I had a good, year and a half to 2 years of like teenage boy. Like really had to go through all that immaturity and like, mature my masculine energy, and it was rough.
And I mean, we don't talk about it a lot, but the teenage boy, beginning of puberty, the prepubescent teenage boy is one racked with insecurity.
Absolutely.
It is the very first time as a boy, really, you are ever insecure, is you're hitting like 12 years old or, prepubescent. And everything everyone says spirals you into emotions you have never even thought of, let alone handled. And so that's huge. That's what I was thinking when you were talking about it, is that like, yeah, you sound like a 12-year-old boy, to be honest. Like that. I'm obsessed, but also I cannot handle this at all. Like,
that's exactly right.
It's so funny because I have a 12-year-old boy and a 9-year-old boy. And the other day my 9-year-old came up to me and he was just like, I just was not expecting this puberty thing. Because his
very
brother,
self-aware
his 12-year-old
9-year-old
brother can be just like such a jerk to him, and it, like all of a sudden their friendship changed because of testosterone, right? It was just like the saddest and cutest little thing. Like I was not planning on this testosterone thing.
And this is a good example of what comes first, the archetype or testosterone. And I would say that the psychic realities on which we form come first. And that then our expression biologically of that involves the chemical testosterone. See, so when you see energy first, and then archetype is the structure that energy expresses itself into, it kind of changes how you interact with that energy. We teach it just the opposite, where here's this biological reality, and you simply got to deal with it, and it's just you got to dealing with it. You having to deal with it. You got to dealing with it. You having to deal with it.
We'll fix it in post.
But the truth is, that isn't it. It's a universal energy that you're now connecting with, and that's really useful to know. You're part of this process. You're part of this expression of masculinity. And because it's something that consciousness wants to express through archetype, it's infinitely valuable. There's something about it. And it doesn't need dogma. It doesn't need a story. It doesn't need priesthood or anything like that. It's just, but there is something true about that being such a valuable experience for a person.
Yeah. And that kind of goes back to the fire hose thing. Like it is going to express through your complexes and your patterns, both, healthy and unhealthy, but also through your biology. And that's really interesting to see it that way. And I, can vouch as a parent that knowing this stuff with my, this is my 7th child. This is my 7th go, guys.
Thanks.
My 4th boy out of 5 boys. That encountering it with this kind of attitude and language has made it so much easier both for him and our whole family. Like this is now a process that we're all observing him engage with a lot of like curiosity and grace, instead of everybody being frustrated because all of a sudden this really nice, cheerful little kid is like moody and rude,
Thank you for listening. Today, on this episode, this is a conversation around archetype, and I hope it stirred some interest and some thoughts for your own personal process with archetype and energy. And if you thought that this was a valuable conversation for you in your meaning path, please share it with somebody, or at least like the video, like the page. We're going to keep having this conversation, and we'd love to have you along. Have a beautiful day.